Teacher Tiara coming here with one of her great stories. Come on down, kids.
Happy Sabbath. I'm so glad to see all of you. Are you guys having a good Sabbath? Yeah. All right. So, hi. My story is something that if you go to our school, you've probably heard me tell this story, but it's one of my favorite stories. And this morning in my devotionals, I read a story about a car accident and how it turned out to be a blessing in disguise, even though car accidents are not that great, right? So I was 3, and we lived far up where it's really cold, past this state, past Canada. What's next? Do you guys know? Do you know? It's really cold. Polar bears live up there. Alaska, you're right. So I lived in Alaska, and I was 2 or 3 years old. And my parents decided that it was time to move from Alaska back down to Washington. So we loaded up our U-Haul, and we got in our Bronco, and we drove from Alaska down to Washington. And there's a highway connecting them through Canada. So my dad was driving. My dad did all the driving, and he was getting tired. So my mom said, hey, Tiara's asleep in the back. I'll drive. It'll be fine. You rest. So they switched spots, and my dad said, well, before I fall asleep, I have to tell you that I just want you to take it slow. Don't speed, because there's a lot of curves and hills, and be careful. And my mom's like, oh, yeah, I'll be fine. So she starts going. My dad falls asleep, and she's going, and she's like, this is so boring. It's taking forever, because nobody else was out at the time, and it was a highway, and it was boring, and she wanted to get to Washington. So she started going a little faster. She was like, this is fine. I can take these corners. And she started to go a little faster and a little faster. And she went around a corner, and she kept going off, and we rolled in the ditch. I was asleep the whole time. I don't remember it, but I woke up, and we were in the ditch. Now, when you wake up and you're in a different place, do you get a little confused? Yeah, it takes you a while to, figure out what's going on. So I wake up. Now, when I went to sleep, my window was right here, right? When I woke up, my window was above me. And I was like, huh. And I didn't scream. I didn't do anything. And the firemen pulled us out, and they said, oh, I really think God was with you guys today. First of all, none of us had scratches on us. No bumps, no bruises, nothing, which we should have had because our Bronco was a huge mess and totaled. But they said, you're angels and God was with you today because your daughter, what should have happened was usually reaction when you wake up and you're in a car accident like that and you're 3, you scream. But I did nothing. I didn't make any sound. And my mouth was closed. If I had screamed, the glass that was shattered above my head would have completely shattered and gone into my throat, and I wouldn't be able to talk to you today. So, bad things can happen, and God can bring great blessings out of them. And what I want to share with you guys today is 2 Corinthians 1, 3, and 4, and it says, praise be to God and the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with comfort we ourselves have received from God. And I like that verse because I get to share that story with you. I get to talk to you today because God protected me in that situation. And I want you guys to remember that God will protect you in your troubles, and he will be there in the good and the bad. So thank you for listening to my story. And I believe it's time for you guys to pick up offering. All right? To read real quick, and it kind of speaks for itself. It's something that God reminded me of this week, so I wanted to share with you. It's a story I wrote a while back because of some circumstances that Todd and I found ourselves in. It's called Runaway. Trucks use lower gears, 6% grade next 5 miles. I never liked seeing those signs, and as perfect as the weather conditions were, that summer day was no exception. We were on the Willamette Pass in Oregon when I came across the warnings, not unlike so many times before, as we crossed the country with 18 wheels under us and a 53-foot trailer tagging behind. Todd knew certain warning signs made me a little nervous, so he considerately reassured me, brakes are good, we're in the right gear. With a wink aimed my way, he continued, let's roll. What he didn't know, lurking underneath, was the airline brakes leaking. The evergreens towered over the 2-lane highway, enveloping the truck as we moseyed down the pass. Confidently, I kicked back and enjoyed the scenery and started snapping pictures. Suddenly, come on, sweetie, you can do it. Todd was nurturing the truck. My attention was instantly ripped away from the landscape, and I looked over to him. He was pumping brakes strangely. The color in his knuckles was fading, and the smell of something burning was starting to creep in. I looked in the mirror, and we were smoking. Brakes are too soft. They aren't gripping. Better hold on and start praying, hun, he said. We had just passed the last truck escape ramp. Matter of fact, just for kicks and giggles, I had taken a picture of it. And we came around one of the many curves on the highway, and the giant orange construction sign warned us, be prepared to stop. Well, that wasn't an option for us, and the highway had been cut down to 1 lane due to the construction. There's nothing left. Brakes are completely gone, hun. Pray hard. Todd informed me as he continued to pray earnestly. As we passed the construction workers, Todd pulled down the leather-braided strap, filling the woods with the echoes of the air horn. The noise alerted all within earshot of the danger. I suppose it alerted me as well as to the seriousness we were in. As I prayed continuously, I looked in the mirror, and through the brakes and the smoke, I noticed the man in the bright orange vest yelling into his radio. I can only imagine he was calling down and warning other workers of the runaway truck. He would also alert the pilot car to hold up the traffic. Help, God. Please stop this truck. Todd prayed earnestly over and over again as he pressed on the brake. He held tight to the steering wheel while gracefully maintaining control around each corner. Please, God, please. We zoomed past the pilot car and the streams of cars it was holding back on our account. Smoke was pouring out of both sides of the truck as we sped down the mountain. The smell of burning brakes had forced itself
into the cab, invading our eyes and nose. The evergreens seemed to be whipping by us. We continued to pray. God, you are the only one that can stop this truck. We need you. We finally started to hit spots on the highway that seemed to level out a bit. The truck slowed a little each time, and it was also losing air pressure, which is something that contributed to our slowing. That's the mechanical stuff I know nothing about or have any desire to. Just ahead was a small turnout on the right, just before a bridge, which of course meant water. We had slowed enough to have hope of stopping before the river, so Todd calmly maneuvered the truck to the turnout. Knowing the guardrail would not stop our 80,000-pound rig from going into the river, just on the other side of the rail, we continued to pray. The end was approaching quickly, and even though we were slowing, it became obvious that we weren't going to stop in time. We had no choice but to get back on the highway, assuming traffic that was behind us would cooperate and let us back in. From my side, all I could see was the guardrail and the drop to the river in front of us, the side of the RV trying to get by us on the left, which of course was the direction we desperately needed to go. But in God's timing is always perfect. Barely rushing by the back corner of the RV, Todd brushed the truck over both lanes of traffic to another turnout opposite of the highway, and the truck continued to slow. Praying and slowing. Finally, the truck stopped, and this is the best part. Once secure in our stop, Todd leaped out with the fire extinguisher in hand, and when we got out of the truck, I got onto my feet and I shook my legs out a bit to make sure they'd carry me, and I wiped away my tears. I went around to the other side of the truck where Todd almost had the fire out. There was actually fire. I couldn't believe our brakes were actually on fire. Little did I know, but where there's smoke, there really is fire. Go figure. The color returned to Todd's hands, as did the feeling in my legs. The trees towered majestically, and the river that seemed like such a threat only minutes before played an awesome little tune. Even the glorious smell of the evergreens, was trying to break through, the lingering stench of the brakes. That beauty that I had admiring when our journey started had returned. But then I slouched back in my Peterbilt air ride chair. It seemed that God gave me a nudge as if to say, that mountain was just as beautiful on the ride down as it was on top, where you were taking pictures. It was your circumstances that changed, not me. Isn't it just one of the many joys of knowing God? He is constant regardless of our circumstances. The beauty of who he is, what he has done for us, and what he is faithful to accomplish in our lives is something we can always count on. Whether in a runaway truck or dealing with a runaway heart, he is always God, and the beauty of his love and character remains the same. Amen? Amen. Let's pray together. Precious Heavenly Father, I thank you so much for who you are and the fact that we can count on who you are all the time. You are constant and unchanging, regardless of our circumstances, God. And we just thank you. And I know that there are a lot of circumstances represented here, and I just ask that you will just make yourself known in each of these circumstances, that you will intervene as is your will. And we just love you. And we just want to give you all praise and all glory and honor this morning, Father. In your precious name, amen.
Good morning, church. Good morning. Have you been blessed this morning? Amen. Amen. When you go through the Bible and you study it, and there's certain names that pop out. People like Moses, David, John, Peter, Paul. You look at these people and you go, oh my goodness. Wow, what heroes of faith. Elijah, all his great stories. When I was little, I thought to myself one day, it would be great. Can't wait to get to heaven so I can meet with the heroes. I want to have like dinner. Top 10 Bible characters. And I started thinking to myself, all right, who's on that list? Okay, so you got to have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. You got to have the big three. You got to have them. Well, I kind of want to meet Joseph because his story is incredible. I love his story. I love Joseph. I'm like, wow, I already got 4 from the Old Testament, so I guess I should balance it out with some New Testament guys, right? Got to get Peter. Got to get Paul. You got to get John the Beloved. And in that, you've got most of the guys who have written the New Testament, so you might as well throw Luke in there too, because he's pretty cool. And then you start looking and you go, okay, now who else can we fill this out? Moses is pretty cool. Like to get Moses in there. Maybe John the Baptist, we'll throw him in there as well. And it's pretty easy. You come up with these lists of people. There are people that come to mind right away when we read this book as the big heroes of the biblical narrative. But how many of you this morning, when you woke up, thought you were going to hear a sermon on a man named Shema? Yeah, no. Now, my question is this just because the new young intern pastor is thinking to himself, how can I be cool and new? Let me find the most obscure story and preach and pull something out of it just because he wants to be cool. This is the equivalent in theology of wearing Birkenstocks and rolled up jeans. I'm the hipster pastor, so I got to come up with something new. Or is it because the story of Shema has deep lessons for us today, even in the 2 verses that he's mentioned? In our world today, everybody wants to know what you think about things, what stand you take on issues. We know the red button topics in our society, and we know that there are people that are like, so what do you think about this? What does the church think about this? What's the Bible say about whatever? We're called to take stands in our lives. We're called to take stands for God. And in the story of Shema, we find a guy who I think his story, his 2 verses that he gets, can tell us a lot about what it means to take a stand for the Lord. The story goes like this, verse 11. And next to him was Shema, the son of Agi, the Hararite. The Philistines gathered together at Lehi, where there was a plot of ground full of lentils. And the men fled from the Philistines. But he, Shema, took his stand in the midst of the plot and defended it and struck down the Philistines. And the Lord worked a great victory. The Lord worked a great victory. Now, the question is, who is this guy? Who is this Shema guy? Is he mentioned anywhere else? Is he really important? What's he doing? Why is he in this story? Why does he even appear in the Bible? Because to defend a field of lentils doesn't seem that important. In the grand stretch of things, it's not like he fought off the Philistines from Jerusalem, the holy city. So why is he here? I did a little bit of research into this guy, and Shema appears 2 times in the entire Bible. 2 times. Pastor Rick is in the middle of a series on Elijah, and Elijah, by contrast, shows up in 2 testaments. He shows up in both chunks of the Bible. He has full chapters dedicated to him. And this guy Shema appears 2 times by name, and they're in this one chapter. He appears here, and then he appears later in a list. So what's his deal? He's the son of Agi the Hararite, and when we look at the Hebrew of that word, Hararite, what it really means is he's a mountaineer. He's a mountain man. Kind of a burlier, outdoorsy individual. Probably keeps to himself most of the time. But the reason he shows up is King David, is listing out his mighty men. This list of guys that followed David around that were his warriors. And Shema is one of these guys. And he's like, all right, don't forget about Shema. Shema's important because Shema, his one thing is he stood up in a big field of lentils and he fought off the Philistines. Seems relatively inconsequential, but I think it's important that he is mentioned because what this tells us is the stand that God may call us to doesn't require us to be a big flashy sort of hero. It doesn't require us to be an A-lister in the hall of faith by our standards. Something you should know about me is I'm a little bit competitive. A little bit. When I was younger, though, when I was 7, 8, 9 years old, I was really, really, really competitive. Very, very, very competitive, especially at home with my parents. I didn't have any brothers or sisters, so the people I could compete with were my mom and dad. Which means that, let me tell you, games of Sorry in the Gosney household were brutal. They were absolutely brutal. And to the 7-year-old Nick, even seeing the sorry card and watching his piece getting taken off the board would drive him to tears because he hated the idea that he could even be a little bit behind. I hated it. There were stretches of my years of my life where we would not play the game Risk. We would not play the game Risk because I wanted to win so badly that even the idea of my mom or dad attacking me and me maybe even losing troops would break my heart. It would actually drive me to tears. I would cry over the thought that I would start to lose. Right? I was always comparing myself to my mom and my dad. How are they doing? And am I beating them? And how are we in this race, so to speak? How are we in this game that we called life? How do I stack up against them? We do the same thing in the Bible. We do the same thing with some of these biblical characters. We look at guys, I don't know if you're like me, but I looked at Paul, I looked at Peter, and I go, my goodness. Peter walked on water for crying out loud. He took like 2 steps and then he started to sink, but he actually walked on water for a little bit. Paul wrote how many epistles in the New Testament? And yet here I am, theology major at Walla Walla at the time, trying to learn Greek. I've written 1 letter. I'm not even close. Paul's got 13 or something like this. I'm looking at myself like, I don't even stack. I'm not even close to this guy. So how can I take a stand that God calls me to when I'm not even close in the big race that we call Christianity, I guess? How can I stack up to these guys? How can I be like Moses? When am I going to get my burning bush moment? When am I going to have that moment where I'm called? Then I look at Shema, son of Agi, the Hararite. And it's into that space that God says, hey, guess what? I want this guy to go do something that's of very little consequence, it seems, to everybody else. We were comparing. He's not taking down Goliath like his buddy David. No, he's taking a stand in a field of lentils. Something that seems very, very tiny. But to God, God says, no, that's where I want Shema to be. Folks, it doesn't matter if we're, in appearance, the big flashy hero like a Peter or a Paul. If God's called us to something, if he calls us to go stand in the field of lentils, it's because God wants us in the field of lentils. He doesn't need everyone to be out walking on water. He doesn't need everyone striking down, calling down fire on Carmel. He needs people in the lentil fields. The story goes on, and it says that the Philistines gathered together at Lehi, where there was a plot of ground full of lentils. They gathered at this camp in Israel, and they're starting to pillage and plunder, and they're beginning to take what's not theirs. They're beginning to raid Israel's food. Now, I don't know what term you may come up with, but for me, this is what we call bullying. These are the Philistines, the bullies of Israel, rolling in and saying, all right, give us your lunch money. Give us your lentils. And we're just going to take it, quite frankly. And all of you are going to run away because we're bigger and badder than you. Let me tell you a story about a 5th grader. This 5th grader is not the biggest kid. He's kind of scrawny. A little bit shorter than everybody else. Hadn't hit that growth spurt that boys get at some point. And he's kind of going through school, waiting for that day when he'll grow. And there's a sixth grader who rolls along, and the sixth grader looks down and says, "Hey, just in case you weren't aware, you're short. I'm going to call you a couple names to remind you that you're short. And we're going to make fun of that. And we're going to make it so that you think it's a weakness. That it's something to be made fun of. And along with that, we might add a couple things, the idea that maybe you're dumb, maybe that you're not capable, and then little moments by moments, other things that this fifth grader wasn't quite good enough at, the sixth grader began to take advantage of, began to point out as things that were going wrong. The fifth grader wasn't quite fast enough with typing. His fingers weren't quite big enough to stretch out across the keyboard, so his words per minute were not quite as fast. The sixth grader took this moment to remind this fifth grader that he wasn't fast and that he's slow and he'll never be good at it. And one day the fifth grader goes home and he's starting to talk to his dad, and he goes, "Dad, I don't know what to do. I'm feeling discouraged. I guess I am this way. I guess I'm just destined to be small and never be good at typing forever. I guess I'm dumb, and I get this is what someone's saying, so I guess it must be true." The father steps in and says, No, son, that's not true. And in fact, we're not going to let this exist any longer. You are in a moment of weakness. You are in a space where you're still learning, and someone is attacking you, and I will not allow that to happen. I will defend you. The father begins to talk with the teacher, and the teacher then notices this happening. And the teacher steps in and says, "Hey, the next time this happens, the next time they're in the computer lab and they're typing away and words are getting said," the teacher says, "We don't do that here. We will not have that behavior. We will not allow bullying to continue in this space." And it's in that moment that we see the character of God, the defender of the weak, step up, rise forth in defense of others. Jesus, throughout his ministry, made a habit of looking for the people who were being oppressed, the poor, the powerless. And it's to those people that he says, "I'm on your side. I will not allow the powerful to continue to abuse their power. I will not allow them to continue to push you aside, to let you just live in the margins." There's a famous story of Jesus when he looks at a woman who's been caught in adultery. And the religious elite come before him and they throw her in her pile of rags in front of him. And after proving to them that they are not as righteous as they claim to be, he goes to her. And this is the powerful part of this story, in my opinion. He goes to this woman who's down, is feeling hurt, and he says, "Where are your accusers?" She looks around and she goes, "I don't know. They're gone." And he goes, "Neither do I condemn you, because I'm on your side. In your moment of weakness, I'm not going to stand on top of you with all my power and all my greatness. I'm not going to stand on top of you and remind you of the mistakes that you've made, of the problems that you may have caused, because that's not what's important to me. The treasure to God is the person, not their problems, not the issues that they have. His deepest desire is to help them know that they are loved by him. When we see Shammah stand up against the Philistines at Lehi, and he stands in his plot of lentils, and the men flee from the Philistines, but he takes his stand and he fights off the Philistines, we see this picture of a man of God defending the weak, defending the oppressed, defending those who are being taken advantage of. And I think this is an important part of the calling of God, is to stand up against those that wish to oppress the poor, that wish to push down against those that are hurting, that are already struggling enough as it is. It's into that space that God calls us to go stand in the lentil field. Shammah takes his stand in the midst of the plot. He defends it. He strikes down the Philistines. And for something that seems so inconsequential, that seems so small and not important, I love the way that this story ends with its 7 words. And the Lord worked a great victory. The question is who is working the victory? Is it Shammah that works this victory? He's the one who's out there cutting down the Philistines, defending Israel. But it's not Shammah at all that is the focus of this story. Though it is he who stands in the field of lentils, it's God who's called him. And subsequently, it's God's victory that occurs. And this is imperatively important when we talk about the stand that God's called us to. It's knowing not just that God's called us, but that it is in fact his victory. There's tons of biblical examples, but perhaps my favorite is the story of Gideon. Gideon is one of my favorite Bible characters, partially because he's like Thomas of the disciples before Thomas. He's the cynic. He's the doubter. He's the guy who's not sure of things. He's the one who wants proof. He's the guy who likes having his hands on things. Gideon is the one who asks for the signs of the fleece. And when he gets a sign, he's like, God, that's not quite good enough yet. I want something else. I want another one. I want you to reverse it this time. But the part of his story that I love is when, after he summons the army of Israel, he brings 22,000 people together. And God comes to him and he says, hey, Gideon, we've got a problem. Gideon, we've got a problem. Gideon's like, yeah, I know we've got a problem. There's 150,000 Midianites out there, and I've got a fraction of that. God says, that's not the problem. There's too many guys. There's too many guys, Gideon. And Gideon goes, are you sure, God? Because that's like, out of the 100 problems that you could have named, that's not one of them, in my opinion. And God says, no, Gideon, we've got too many guys. I need you to go out there, and I want you to tell anybody who wants to go home, send them home. And over half the army leaves. 12,000 of that 22,000 just take off. Now Gideon's like, all right, cool. Thanks, God. Now I have less people. Now the odds are even worse. Perfect. It was going to be hard as it was, but now it seems almost impossible. And God comes to him again. He says, Gideon, you've still got a problem. You've still got a problem, Gideon. There's still too many guys. That 10,000 is still too many. And Gideon goes, are you sure? Are you sure, God? Are you sure that's the problem we need to be addressing? Because they still outnumber us 15 to 1 at best. God says, no, I need you to get rid of some more. So they go out to the river and they drink the water. We know this story. And they get down to this measly number of 300. Gideon and 300 guys. And who works the great victory? God. God is the one who works the great victory. And the reason he sends off all these people, the reason he tells Gideon, I want you to get rid of the 21,700 people, is because I want you to know, beyond a shadow of a doubt, who it is that the victory belongs to. Gideon, this is not your victory. It's not even Israel's victory. This is the Lord's victory. When we see Shammah take his stand in the field of lentils, there's no question that this is the Lord's victory in the eyes of the scribe, in the eyes of David. Folks, in our lives, like I mentioned, we're called to take stands for things. In today's society, we are becoming increasingly polarized on everything, it seems. And people will come and they'll say, all right, so what do we think about this? What do we want to say? What's the stand we're going to take on this issue? And the question is not, what is my stand on it? But what's God's stand? And what's his victory that's going to come out of this? This is incredibly important. And I wish I could tell you, here's the formula that will crack the code on what it exactly is that God's saying, here's my stance on this for you. Here's the field of lentils that, Pastor Rick needs to go stand in. Here's the one that I need to go stand in. And here's the one that each one of you needs to go stand in. But I can't say that. It all stems from a relationship with him. It's interesting that Shammah's story gets told in this narrative of the Bible, his 2 verses where it talks about him standing in a field of lentils. And the reason his story gets told at all, the reason it's mentioned in reality, is because of his relationship with a guy named David. He was friends with the king. Where this appears in the biblical story in 2 Samuel is it starts out with David's sort of last will and testament to Israel. David's on his deathbed. He's getting ready to be done being king. He's lived his life. He's done a whole lot. And so he's sitting in bed, I imagine. He's got the scribe there, and he's like, all right, so here's my last couple thoughts I want to share with my kingdom. But then as he's finishing those up, he goes, wait. There's like 30 guys I want to mention. There's 30 guys I want to talk about, and he mentions Shammah in there. But the reason Shammah is victorious is not because of his relationship with David. It's because of his relationship with the Lord. And that's more important than getting mentioned in a couple verses here and there. It's knowing whose victory is. Ladies and gentlemen, we are a church here. We stand in a community in a time where there's a lot going on, and people are asking us to take stands. They're asking us to rise up, to maybe go on top of Carmel and call down fire. But God doesn't always call us towards the Mount Carmel. He doesn't call us necessarily to say, all right, let's bring down the fire on top of this world and remind everybody of God's supreme power. God calls us into a space where we are connected with him. And the church is not just a building. It's not just a group of people that get together on a Sabbath morning. No, the church is a beachhead for the kingdom of God. It is this space where God says, my kingdom is coming, and we've already started putting my fingerprints on this earth. And so as we sing this last song, as we continue throughout today, as we move into next week, I encourage you with this thought. We are each ambassadors for the King of the universe. And we stand where he calls us to stand, whether that be on top of Carmel or in a lowly lentil field. Lord, you care about us more than anything we can imagine. Lord, you call us to take stands for you. Lord, my prayer is that as we take our stand, it's your stand that we're taking, and that through you we will see your victories and we will be able to praise you when they happen. Bless us now as we leave this space, as we go out as your ambassadors, as your missionaries, sharing your life, being reflections of your love. In your name I pray.